He was paid millions to play the bad guy. He had the gold chains, the toothpick, and the "hey yo" catchphrase that defined an entire era of wrestling. But years before he was ever famous, a real-life altercation in a dark parking lot left another man dead at his hands. That single traumatic event, a moment of actual bad he was legally cleared for but could never escape, would fuel the addictions that turned his public character into a tragic private reality. This is the story of Scott Hall. How does a man haunted by one killing survive a life of pretending to be bad? He did not enter the world as a bad guy. He was not born with a toothpick in his mouth or a gold chain around his neck. On October 20th, 1958, in the quiet coastal lands of St. Mary's County, Maryland, he was simply Scott Oliver Hall, the son of an American Army officer. This single fact of his father's career would become the most dominant, defining, and destabilizing force of his entire childhood. Before Scott Hall could form his first coherent memory of a hometown, he was already leaving it. The life of a military family in the 1950s and 60s was one of perpetual motion. It was a life lived out of cardboard boxes and government-issued housing. For a young boy, this meant the concept of home was not a fixed point on a map. It was not a specific house with a familiar smell or a bedroom covered in pennants. Home was wherever his mother and father were, and, more pressingly, wherever the U.S. Army dictated they would be for the next 12, 18, or 24 months. From his earliest years, Scott's world was a blur of new faces, new schools, and new temporary friends. He would just begin to learn the layout of a new neighborhood, just begin to feel a sense of belonging with a local group of kids when the news would come. His father had new orders. They were moving again. This cycle was relentless. It tore up his entire life again and again. This constant upheaval trained him in a very specific and isolating set of survival skills. He became a master observer. When you are always the new kid, you learn to walk into a new classroom or a new playground and instantly read the room. You become a social chameleon, able to assess the hierarchy, identify the leaders, and understand the unwritten rules of this new temporary tribe. You learn to adapt your personality, to be funny, to be tough, to be quiet, whatever was necessary to survive those first few brutal weeks of being the outsider. But this adaptation comes at a cost. Scott learned to build walls. He learned not to get too attached because attachment led to the pain of separation. Friendships were, by necessity, fleeting. Why invest deeply in a bond that you knew, with absolute certainty, would be severed in a year? It was easier to remain slightly aloof, to project an aura of self-sufficiency. It was here, in the schoolyards of a dozen different military bases, that the first seeds of cool were planted. It was not an affectation, it was armor. It was a defense mechanism to protect a boy who was tired of saying goodbye. His only true constant was his family, particularly his brothers. They were the only other people in his world who understood this nomadic life. They were his first clique, a small, tight-knit unit navigating a world of constant change. They were his allies, his rivals, and his measuring stick. As he grew, this life began to grate against his emerging personality. The military world his father inhabited was one of rigid structure, absolute authority, and unyielding rules. Scott, in contrast, was becoming a free spirit, a boy with a growing rebellious streak. He was a product of the counterculture era that was bubbling just outside the fortified walls of the military bases. He inherently bristled at the strict yes sir, no sir environment. He was a square peg in a round olive drab hole, and his resentment for arbitrary authority began to simmer. Then came the move that would shape his adolescence: Germany. The Hall family was stationed in Munich, a world away from the American bases he had known, but even here, life was an insulated experience. He attended All-American High School, a school populated entirely by the children of American military and diplomatic personnel. He was in a foreign land, yet still not truly part of it. He was an American outsider in Germany, just as he had been the new kid from Maryland and Virginia, or from Virginia and Texas. The label was constant, only the backdrop changed. It was in Munich that the second defining event of his youth occurred, his physical transformation. Scott Hall didn't just grow tall, he exploded. He shot up to his full adult height of 6 feet 7 inches, towering over his peers and even most of his teachers. This was a game changer. He was no longer just the new kid. He was the new giant. His sheer size, combined with the natural athleticism he possessed, made him an instant commodity in the school's sports programs. He was a natural on the basketball court, his height and coordination making him a dominant force. He excelled at soccer, his long-legged stride covering the field with a deceptive speed. This was his first taste of real, undeniable validation. In the gymnasium or on the field, he wasn't just another transient face. He was the man. He was a star. For a time, it seemed like a clear path forward. A young man with his physical gifts could write his own ticket to a college scholarship, perhaps even a professional career. Coaches saw his raw potential, but Scott, true to his nature, resisted. The very structure of high-level organized sports, the grueling practices, the unwavering authority of the coach, the rigid playbooks, felt too familiar. It was, in his mind, just another uniform, another set of rules, another system trying to control him. It was a faint echo of the military life he had grown to resent. He had the talent, but he lacked the discipline, or, more accurately, he refused to submit to their discipline. He preferred pickup games, where his talent could shine on his own terms. He was already carving his own path, one defined by a defiant need for independence. His swagger was now more than just a defense. It was a statement. It was the physical manifestation of his personality, a slow, confident, almost arrogant gait that dared anyone to challenge him, or worse, to try and tell him what to do. This burgeoning independence was tested by a third, devastating event, one that would fracture the final pillar of his stability. His parents' marriage, perhaps strained by the pressures of military life and constant relocations, collapsed. They divorced. For Scott, this was a profound rupture. The family unit, his one and only anchor in a life of perpetual motion, was broken. The man who represented authority, structure, and strength, his father, was suddenly gone from his daily life. Scott, his mother, and his brothers were now their own separate entity. The emotional void this created was immediate and immense. It was a father wound, a deep subconscious yearning for the strong male guidance and approval that had vanished. This loss solidified his rebellious streak. With his father's authority figure removed, Scott's disdain for rules became more pronounced. He was a giant teenager, full of restless energy, charisma, and a simmering anger at a world that had offered him no roots and had just taken away his foundation. He was a man-child with no map, graduating high school in a foreign country with no clear future. So he did what he had always done. He moved. He returned to the United States, but it was a return to nothing. He had no hometown to go back to. He had no childhood friends to reunite with. He was an American who felt like an alien in his own country. He was, for the first time, completely and truly on his own. He began to drift. He bounced from one city to another, taking whatever odd jobs he could find that suited his intimidating frame. He was a roofer, a construction worker, a bouncer. These were tough physical cash-in-hand jobs. He was learning to survive in the civilian world, a world with no safety net. This period was crucial in honing his tough guy persona. It was one thing to be the big man on a high school campus. It was another to be a 6'7" young man in a rough bar or on a grueling construction site. He learned to handle himself. He learned that his size, combined with his cool confidence, was a weapon. He could de-escalate trouble with a look, a quiet word, or if necessary, a sudden and overwhelming physical presence. He was not yet the addict he would become, but this world introduced him to the culture of self-medication. A long, back-breaking day on a roof in the hot sun was followed by a case of cold beer. A stressful night bouncing at a rowdy bar was unwound with shots of whiskey. Alcohol was the social lubricant, the painkiller, and the reward. It was normalized, a part of the blue-collar, tough guy life he was living. It was a habit being formed, a tool he was learning to use to blunt the edges of his restless, aimless existence. His drifting eventually led him to the one place in America that was arguably as transient as he was, Orlando, Florida. In the early 1980s, Orlando was not the family-friendly theme park empire it is today. It was a grittier, faster, and cheaper party town, a destination for people looking to escape their pasts, reinvent themselves, or simply get lost in the neon and noise. It was a perfect match for Scott Hall. He was now in his early 20s, a man of incredible physical presence and a magnetically cool personality. He needed a job that fit. He found one, seemingly tailor-made for his unique set of skills. He became a bartender at a strip club. This was not just a job, it was an immersion. It was a nightly education in the rawest forms of human nature. A strip club, especially in that era, was a world unto itself. It operated on a cash-and-carry basis, fueled by a river of alcohol, the allure of sex, and the constant simmering potential for conflict. Scott was not just serving drinks. He was the establishment's primary deterrent. His post behind the bar made him the unofficial head of security, the towering, watchful presence who ensured the delicate, often volatile, ecosystem of the club remained in balance. Night after night he watched. He saw the performances both on the stage and from the customers. He saw the hustlers and the lonely men. He learned to read the subtle shift in a man's eyes that meant trouble was coming. He perfected his ability to project effortless, unshakable authority. He could quiet a drunk with a low, steady voice, or freeze a potential fight with a single, deliberate step from behind the bar. He was, in effect, in a real-life theater, honing a character. He was learning the psychology of intimidation and charisma. He was, without realizing it, crafting the bad guy. He was 24 years old, a charismatic giant in the epicenter of a nightly party. He was popular, he was feared, and he was respected in this small, neon-lit world. But he was also surrounded every single night by the two elements that would come to define his life's great tragedy. The first was the alcohol, now no longer just a reward, but an ever-present, readily available coping mechanism, flowing as freely as water. The second was the unpredictable, often dangerous nature of the clientele. Men who were drunk, impulsive, and sometimes armed. Scott Hall, the boy who had no home, had finally found a territory he could call his own, but it was a territory built on a fault line, and the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. He was a man carrying the deep, unhealed wounds of a nomadic childhood and a fractured family, and he was standing directly in the path of an event that would inflict a new, far darker wound, one that would bleed for the rest of his life. That wound wasn't inflicted in a war zone or on a battlefield, but in the one place he had briefly called his own, the club, the air in an early 1980s Orlando strip club was a thick, volatile cocktail. It was a humid mix of cheap perfume, stale beer, cigarette smoke, and the metallic tang of desperation. For Scott Hall, now 24 years old, this was just another night at the office. He stood behind the bar, a 6'7" sentinel, watching the predictable ballet of drunken customers and weary dancers. He was the club's de facto peacemaker, a man whose sheer size usually ended conflicts before they began. But on a specific fateful night in 1983, his size would not be a deterrent. It would be a lightning rod. The details of what happened next have been pieced together from police reports, court records, and the fragmented third-hand accounts of those who knew him. It began, as it so often did, with a dispute. A male patron, drunk and aggressive, got into an altercation. Accounts differ on the cause. Some say it was over a woman, others that it was just a random whiskey-fueled confrontation. Scott, doing his job, intervened. The confrontation escalated. It spilled out of the club's neon-lit doorway and into the dark, humid anonymity of the parking lot. This was no longer a barroom squabble. The man was enraged, and he had a gun. What followed was not a choreographed wrestling match. It was a raw, chaotic, and terrified struggle for survival. Scott, despite his size, was facing a firearm. In the ensuing scramble, a blur of shouting, adrenaline, and fear, he managed to get his hands on the weapon. The two men wrestled for control of the gun. A shot, or shots, rang out, cannon claps in the night air. And then, silence. The man was dead. Scott Hall, 25 years old, stood in a dark parking lot, his ears ringing, his life irrevocably and horribly altered. He had taken a human life. The immediate aftermath was a cold, harsh reality. The police arrived, the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the darkness, illuminating a scene of pure tragedy. Scott was arrested. He was not a charismatic bartender anymore. He was a suspect. He was taken to jail and charged with second-degree murder. The terror of that experience is hard to overstate. He was a young man, adrift and directionless, and he was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in a Florida state prison. The legal system, however, eventually sided with his version of events. Witnesses corroborated his story. It was a clear-cut case of self-defense. The man had pulled the gun. Scott had fought for his life. After a terrifying period of legal limbo, the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. The court, in effect, declared him an innocent man, a victim who had protected himself. But the legal system and the human conscience operate in two entirely different jurisdictions. Scott Hall walked out of that jail, legally a free man, but in reality, he was now imprisoned by something far more permanent: trauma. He never spoke of it. Not to his closest friends, not to his family, not to his wives. It was locked away in a vault deep inside him. Decades later, his best friend Kevin Nash would state that he knew something dark haunted Scott, some ghost that was always with him, but Scott would never, ever give it a name. This event is the key. It is the Rosetta Stone to understanding the man behind the bad guy. He was now, in his own mind, a killer. Self-defense is a legal term. It does little to quiet the nightmares. It doesn't erase the image of the event, the sound of the shot, or the profound existential weight of ending a life. He was consumed by a guilt and a post-traumatic stress that, in an era that dismissed mental health, had no name and no outlet. This trauma became the engine for his self-destruction. The void left by his father, the instability of his childhood, those were the kindling. The shooting was the gasoline and the match. His relationship with alcohol, which had been a bouncer's casual habit, now transformed into a desperate, pathological need. He wasn't drinking to be social. He was drinking to silence the memory that played on a loop in the back of his mind. He was, in effect, trying to drown the ghost that haunted him. He had to get out of Orlando. The city itself was a crime scene, every street corner a reminder. He was a 6'7" charismatic young man with a physique carved from hard labor, but he was now a ticking time bomb of unresolved trauma. He needed an escape. He needed a new life, a new identity, a world where he could channel the aggression, the pain, and the rage that were now his constant companions. He found it in the most unlikely of places, the garish, theatrical, and physically brutal world of professional wrestling. In 1984, Scott Hall decided to become a wrestler. On the surface, it was a logical choice for a man of his size and athletic background, but psychologically, it was a profound symbolic act. It was a world of performative violence. It was a world where he could be a tough guy, where he could engage in combat, but where no one really got hurt. It was a kayfabe world, a staged reality, where the consequences were predetermined, where the violence wasn't real, and where he would never, ever have to face that same life-or-death horror again. It was the perfect, structured escape, a way to be the tough guy in a safe, controlled environment. He moved to South Florida and began training, pouring his energy into learning the craft. His physical gifts were immediately apparent. He was a natural, picking up the intricate footwork and the complex psychology of in-ring storytelling with remarkable speed. He was big, he was handsome, and he had an innate charisma that dripped off him. He was fast-tracked, debuting in 1984 for Championship Wrestling from Florida, a key territory in the NWA. He was so green he practically squeaked, but he had the it factor. He was immediately thrust into a program with the territory's top star and booker, the legendary American Dream Dusty Rhodes. Dusty saw the potential in Scott, the size, the look, the talking ability. He was a blue-chip prospect, but his first gimmick was, to put it mildly, forgettable. He was paired with another tall, muscular rookie named Dan Spivey, and they were dubbed American Starship. They were inexplicably a tag team of astronauts. They wore futuristic-looking silver vests and tight pants. It was a silly, cartoonish gimmick, but it served its purpose. It got Scott in the ring, night after night in front of different crowds. It was his on-the-job training. He was learning how to take bumps, how to call a match, and how to interact with an audience. This was also his formal introduction to the wrestler's lifestyle. The wrestling territories were a grueling circuit. You drove hundreds of miles every single day from one small town's armory to the next high school gym. You'd perform for 15 minutes, shower, pile back into a cramped car with 3 other large, sweating men, and drive all night to the next town, only to do it all over again. The physical toll was immense. The bumps were real. His 6'7" frame hitting the hard wooden mat night after night created a symphony of chronic pain. His back, his knees, his shoulders, everything ached all the time. And what was the medicine of choice in this traveling circus? Alcohol and pills. It was the culture. You had a beer after the show to socialize and unwind. You took a handful of painkillers to dull the ache in your back, so you could sleep for 3 hours in a cheap motel before the next long drive. For Scott Hall, this culture was a death trap. He was a man already predisposed to self-medication, a man carrying a heavy, dark secret that screamed for him to numb it. Now, his chosen profession not only excused this behavior, it encouraged it. His drinking, which had begun as a bouncer's habit and evolved into a post-trauma coping mechanism, was now fully integrated into his professional life. It was just being one of the boys. But for Scott, the off switch that others possess simply didn't exist. He wasn't drinking to cope with the bumps. He was using the bumps as an excuse to feed the demon that the 1983 shooting had unleashed. He left CWF and in 1985 headed north to the American Wrestling Association, based in Minnesota and run by the legendary Verne Gagne. The AWA was a major territory, a step up in prestige and visibility. This was where Scott Hall stopped being a rookie and started becoming a star. Gagne, a notorious old-school taskmaster, ran a training camp that was legendarily brutal, designed to weed out the weak. Scott survived it. He was repackaged, this time as a dominant, confident heel. And in a move that would prove pivotal, he was paired with another supremely talented, charismatic young wrestler, Curt Hennig, who would later become the iconic Mr. Perfect, was a wrestling prodigy, the son of a legend. He and Scott were a perfect match. They were both big, athletic, and had a natural, arrogant chemistry. As a tag team, they were brilliant. They ascended the ranks, and on January 18, 1986, in a controversial match, they defeated the Long Riders to win the AWA World Tag Team Championship. This was Scott's first major taste of gold. He was on top of a major promotion. This period was his college education in wrestling. Working with Hennig, one of the greatest in-ring technicians of all time, was a master class. Scott learned psychology. He learned why a move was done, not just how. He learned timing, how to milk a crowd, how to build anticipation, and how to get heat. He learned the subtle art of making his opponent look good, which in turn made him look even better. His cool persona, the one he had built as a self-sufficient army brat, was now being polished into a marketable on-screen character. He was no longer just a big guy. He was a smart big guy, an arrogant jock who knew he was better than everyone else. But as his star rose, his personal demons kept pace. The AWA, while prestigious, was a notoriously disorganized and poorly paying promotion in its dying days. The paychecks were small, the travel was just as brutal, and the culture of self-medication was identical. Scott's reputation for partying began to grow. He was becoming known as a man who could go all night, a functional alcoholic who could drink a staggering amount, sleep for 2 hours, and still put on a 20-minute classic with Hennig. This functionality, however, was an illusion. It was a high-wire act that couldn't last. He was burning the candle at both ends and in the middle. The trauma of 1983 was always there, just beneath the surface, demanding to be fed. The alcohol was his medication, but the dosage was steadily increasing. After a successful run, he and Hennig eventually dropped the titles and went their separate ways. Scott Hall was now a seasoned, established veteran. He had the size, the look, the championship pedigree, and the in-ring smarts. He was a can't-miss prospect. He spent time in other territories, further honing his craft, including his first brief and largely unmemorable run with World Championship Wrestling. He also traveled to Japan, wrestling for New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he was exposed to the hard-hitting, strong style of Japanese wrestling, adding another layer of realism and intensity to his work. Then in 1991, he returned to WCW, which was now under new management and desperately looking for new stars. They saw Scott and immediately recognized his potential. They just needed the right gimmick. They gave him a manager, a flamboyant and energetic personality who was then a relative unknown, Diamond Dallas Morteau Page. They repackaged Scott as the Diamond Stud. This was the prototype. This was Razor Ramon 0.5. He was a vain, arrogant, chisel-bodied heel. He wore flashy jackets, carried a toothpick, and oozed a dismissive, self-obsessed charisma. He would strut to the ring, chewing his toothpick, and look down on his opponents and the crowd with pure disdain. The character was an almost perfect fit, a fusion of his natural arrogance and the tough guy persona he'd cultivated his entire life. The relationship with DDP at this time was purely professional, but it was the first connection between two men whose lives would become intrinsically linked. DDP, a notorious health and fitness fanatic, was likely baffled by Hall's hard-living lifestyle, but the professional chemistry was there. The Diamond Stud was a solid mid-card act. He had good matches and great presence, but he was still just a diamond in the rough. The character was almost there, but it was missing one key ingredient. It was missing the edge, the street authenticity, the story. Unbeknownst to Scott, his work as the Diamond Stud was being watched very, very closely by a man in the rival organization. The World Wrestling Federation, Vince McMahon, the chairman of the WWF, was looking for his next great character. He saw Scott Hall not as the Diamond Stud, but as something else entirely. He saw a Tony Montana-esque movie villain, a Scarface for the 90s. Scott's contract with WCW was coming to an end. He was a phenomenal talent, but he was also a known risk. His drinking was becoming less of a quirk and more of a problem. He was a bad boy in all the wrong ways, but the WWF was willing to take a chance. They saw $1 million look and $1 billion charisma. In 1992, Scott Hall received the phone call that would change his life and the entire wrestling industry. He was going to the WWF. He was leaving the Diamond Stud behind. He was about to be reborn, repackaged with a gimmick so perfect, so potent, that it would launch him into the stratosphere. He was about to become the bad guy. But as he prepared to step onto the biggest stage in the world, the ghost of 1983 was packing its bags right alongside him, a silent, thirsty passenger on his road to superstardom. The phone call from Vince McMahon wasn't just an offer. It was an escape. Scott Hall, the Diamond Stud, was a man of immense untapped potential, but he was also a man suffocating under the weight of his own reputation in World Championship Wrestling. He was known as a phenomenal talent, but also as a man who lived the tough guy life a little too authentically. The parties, the drinking, the volatility, it was all becoming a liability. He was a 6'7" powder keg, and the ghost of 1983, the trauma he buried in that Orlando parking lot, was the silent, ever-present fuse. But Vince McMahon didn't just see a liability. He saw an asset. He saw something raw, gritty, and above all, real. The WWF in the early 1990s was a day-glow circus of cartoon superheroes and occupational gimmicks. Vince had wrestling garbage men, wrestling clowns, and wrestling tax collectors. What he didn't have was a stone-cold, believable cinematic villain. When Vince asked Scott for ideas, Scott didn't pitch a wrestling character. He pitched a movie. He had been watching Scarface over and over, mesmerized by Al Pacino's portrayal of Tony Montana. He saw the arrogance, the coiled, violent energy, the outsider's rage, and the desperate, insatiable hunger for the world and everything in it. He didn't just want to play a character. He wanted to inhabit an archetype. He pitched the idea of a Cuban-American gangster, a recent emigre from Miami, a man who was slick, dangerous, and dripping with an unearned, arrogant, cool Vince, a marketing genius, saw the potential immediately, but he saw it through his own broader lens. He sandpapered the character's hardest edges. The drug-fueled paranoia of Montana was out, but the essence, the accent, the swagger, the gold chains, the unabashed love of money, the sheer audacity, that was pure gold. They workshopped a name. Scott, with his trademark blunt arrogance, told the executives, "I'm a bad guy. I'm the bad guy." And just like that, a legend was born. But he needed a moniker. Scott, in a stroke of genius, suggested Razor, as in a razor's edge, sharp, dangerous, and always on the line, Razor Ramon. It sounded like a threat. It sounded, as Scott would say, too sweet. The WWF machine, when it fully commits, is a sight to behold. They didn't just debut him, they anointed him. They flew Scott to Miami, his old stomping ground, and filmed a series of groundbreaking vignettes. In these promos, Razor Ramon wasn't in a wrestling ring, he was in his world. He was leaning against a pink Cadillac on Ocean Drive, gold chains glistening on his chest, a toothpick perched arrogantly between his lips. He was in a sun-drenched cafe, his hair slicked back, talking down to the gringos and the macos who populated his world. With a thick, almost cartoonish Cuban accent, he delivered the lines that would define him. Say hello to the bad guy. It was electric. It was like nothing else on WWF television. He wasn't yelling about Python power or cosmic energy. He was just cool. He was a believable, aspirational kind of scoundrel. He was the kind of villain that men wanted to be and women wanted to be with. When Razor Ramon finally walked into a WWF arena in 1992, he wasn't a rookie. He was a star. His ascent was immediate and decisive. He was not put in preliminary matches. He was instantly inserted into the main event scene, standing across the ring from titans like Macho Man, Randy Savage, and Ric Flair. He was a huge man, but he didn't wrestle like a typical plodding giant. He was athletic, psychological, and smooth. His finisher, the Razor's Edge, was a brutal crucifix-style powerbomb that looked utterly devastating. Yet he delivered it with a kind of graceful contempt. He was booked as an unstoppable heel, a dominant force, but a strange unintended thing began to happen. The cool factor, the very thing that made him such a compelling villain, was too effective. The WWF's target audience of kids and families should have booed him, and they did at first, but the teenagers, the young adults, the smart fans, they were mesmerized. He was the Fonz. He was James Dean. He was the rebel archetype. And in a world of primary colored good guys, the bad guy was the most interesting man in the room. Behind the curtain, however, the man, Scott Hall, was running headfirst into the most dangerous convergence of his life: money, fame, and the most grueling, soul-crushing travel schedule in the history of entertainment. The WWF in the early 90s was not a part-time job. It was a 300-day-a-year death march. Scott would fly from New York to Los Angeles, wrestle a 20-minute match, shower, get in a rental car, drive 3 hours to a cheap motel, sleep for 4 hours, fly to a different city, and do it all again, and again, and again. For a man who had built his entire identity as a nomadic army brat, this was, in a twisted way, familiar. But the physical toll was beyond anything he had ever experienced. His 6'7" frame was not designed to be folded into a coach-class airplane seat. His back, his knees, his shoulders, they were in a state of perpetual screaming agony. And Scott already had a well-established, time-tested coping mechanism for pain: alcohol. Now, with a fat WWF paycheck, he had unlimited access. But there was more. The road, the fame, the pressure, it all woke up the ghost. The trauma of 1983, the man he killed, the guilt he had buried, it was always there, scratching at the walls of his consciousness. He drank to dull the physical pain. He drank to silence the ghost. And now, with his main event money, he added a new, more powerful tool to his arsenal: cocaine. Cocaine didn't just numb the pain, it gave him the energy to overcome it. It allowed him to stay up all night drinking, get 2 hours of sleep, and still have the energy to fly across the country and put on a 25-minute classic. He wasn't just a functional alcoholic anymore. He was a high-functioning polyaddict. He was, for a time, managing the impossible. He was a mess in his private life, but a consummate professional in the ring. He was never late. He never missed a show. He always protected his opponents, ensuring their safety. He was, in the language of the business, a hell of a hand. But he was lonely. This life on the road, it was the same isolation of his childhood, just amplified. He needed a family. He needed his own clique. He found it piece by piece. First was Shawn Michaels, another wrestler who was in many ways his mirror image. Arrogant, phenomenally talented, and battling his own demons. Then came Sean Waltman, the 1-2-3 Kid, a young, smaller wrestler whom Scott, in a famous televised upset, had put over. Making him a star, Scott took the Kid under his wing. And then came the man who would define his life. In 1993, a new giant arrived in the WWF, a 7-foot charismatic monster named Diesel. His name was Kevin Nash. The bond between Scott Hall and Kevin Nash was instantaneous and seismic. They were, as Nash would later say, kindred. They were both huge, smart, and saw the wrestling business not as a sport, but as a hustle. They had the same dark sense of humor, the same cynical worldview. In Nash, Scott found his brother, his bodyguard, and his ultimate enabler soon. The group was rounded out by a new arrival, the methodical Hunter Hearst Helmsley. They were the clique. This was not just a group of friends, it was a corporate cabal. It was a rolling, non-stop party. It was a mobile support unit. They traveled together, ate together, drank together, and most importantly, politicized together. They were the army brats and the driven outsiders, and they formed a tight, impenetrable unit. They saw themselves as the real talent, the ones driving the business forward, and they used their collective power to influence Vince McMahon, control storylines, and secure their financial futures. Scott Hall was the cool uncle of the group, the respected veteran, the K-Lick originator with his family around him. He felt invincible. He was also, for the first time, in an echo chamber. His drinking wasn't a problem, it was just part of the clique. His drug use wasn't addiction, it was blowing off steam. They protected him, they covered for him, and they partied with him. They were the best friends he ever had, and tragically, the worst influence he could possibly have found. Meanwhile, his on-screen career was reaching a zenith. In late 1993, Shawn Michaels was stripped of the Intercontinental Championship. A battle royal was held to crown a new champion, and Razor Ramon emerged victorious. This was his first WWF title, and to Scott, the Intercontinental belt was his world title. He elevated it. He defended it with a ferocity and a quality of performance that made it, for a time, the most prestigious championship in the company. But Shawn Michaels claimed to be the real champion, as he had never been beaten for the belt. This set the stage for a confrontation at the biggest show of them all, WrestleMania X, in March 1994 at Madison Square Garden. It would not be a standard match. It would be a ladder match, a gimmick that had been used before, but never on this stage. Never with this level of anticipation. Both championships would be suspended above the ring. The first man to climb the ladder and retrieve them would be the undisputed Intercontinental Champion. What happened next was not wrestling. It was art. For 25 minutes, Scott Hall and Shawn Michaels created a masterpiece of violence, timing, and storytelling. It was brutal, innovative, and utterly flawless. They used the ladder not just as a prop, but as a weapon, a character in the story. The match was a symphony of sickening, wince-inducing bumps and breathtaking athletic high spots. Scott, the bad guy heel, was so spectacular, so resilient, so cool in his defiance, that the New York crowd, the toughest in the world, began to cheer him. When he finally pushed Michaels off the ladder and retrieved his gold, the explosion of sound was not for a heel victory. It was an ovation. That night, Scott Hall and Shawn Michaels didn't just steal the show, they became the show. They had, in a single match, changed the entire wrestling industry. They had set a new bar for athletic storytelling, a bar that performers would spend the next 2 decades trying to reach. Scott Hall was now, officially, a legend. He was on top of the world. Razor Ramon was on lunchboxes, video games, and action figures. He was a household name, a bona fide superstar, and he was, privately, falling apart. The pressure to top himself was immense. The physical toll from that one match alone was staggering. His body was screaming. The Clique, now the undeniable center of the locker room's gravity, was partying harder than ever. Celebrating their success, Scott's drinking escalated. His drug use escalated. The functionality began to fade. His marriage to Dana Bergio, which had begun in 1990, was crumbling. He was a father to his son Cody, and soon his daughter Cassidy. But he was a ghost in his own home. He was a man lost to the road, lost to the party, lost to the character. The guilt of being an absent father and a terrible husband became just another log on the fire, another reason to drink, another wound to numb. It was a vicious, self-sustaining feedback loop. He drank because he felt guilty, and he felt guilty because he drank. On screen, the WWF had no choice but to listen to the audience. In 1994, Razor Ramon officially turned face, or good guy. The transition was seamless because the fans had already chosen him. He was now the cool good guy, feuding with his real-life best friends, Diesel and Shawn Michaels. He had a rematch with Shawn Michaels at SummerSlam 1995, another ladder match. It was, by any measure, a fantastic, incredible athletic performance, but it couldn't recapture the magic, the raw surprise of the first. It was a brilliant sequel. But the original had already changed the world. By late 1995, Scott Hall was physically and emotionally burnt out. His body was a wreck. His addictions were becoming less of a backstage rumor and more of an open, troubling secret. He was still a top star, but he was becoming erratic, a liability Vince McMahon's patience was wearing thin. Scott, in turn, was feeling deeply disrespected. He was one of the company's top performers, one of its biggest merchandise sellers, and yet he was being paid significantly less than other main event stars like Bret Hart. He was in his late 30s. He knew his body couldn't take the brutal WWF schedule for much longer. He was in pain, he was tired, and he was angry. And then, just as it had in 1992, the phone rang. It wasn't Vince McMahon, it was Eric Bischoff, the man in charge of WCW, the man who was actively trying to put Vince McMahon out of business. The offer he made was staggering. It wasn't just a raise, it was a revolution. Bischoff offered Scott a multi-year, fully guaranteed 7-figure contract, but the money, as unbelievable as it wasn't even the best part. Bischoff offered him fewer dates, a significantly lighter schedule. No more 300-day-a-year grind. He was offering him a chance to save his body. He was offering him a chance to get paid main event money without working a main event schedule. Scott, the Army brat from Part 1, had no deep-seated loyalty to the WWF. The WWF was not his home. It was a territory. It was a job, and he was just offered a better job. He went to his best friend, Kevin Nash, whose contract was also coming up. They both saw the writing on the wall. This was their one last chance to cash in, to secure their families' futures. They made their decision. They were leaving. They were going south to Atlanta. Scott Hall's final act in the WWF would become one of the most infamous and important moments in modern wrestling history. On May 19, 1996, at Madison Square Garden, the Clique had their last night together. Shawn Michaels wrestled Diesel in the main event. After the match, Razor Ramon and Hunter Hearst Helmsley came to the ring. All four men, 2 good guys and 2 bad guys, embraced in a group hug. They broke character. They shattered the illusion, or kayfabe, in the most sacred arena in wrestling. It was called the curtain call. To the company, it was an act of supreme, arrogant disrespect. But to Scott Hall, it was the perfect exit. It was him, the ultimate outsider, the ultimate rebel, thumbing his nose at the very rules and the very system he had come to resent. He was leaving. He was doing it with his family, and he was doing it on his terms. He was walking away from Razor Ramon, the character that had made him a global superstar. He was walking away from the company that had given him a platform. He was walking south to WCW with a guaranteed contract in his pocket and his best friend by his side. He had more money than he had ever dreamed of, and a lighter schedule than he had had in years. He was, by all accounts, on top of the world, but he was taking all his baggage with him, the trauma, the guilt, the pills, and the bottle. And he was walking into an environment with less supervision, more money, and more creative freedom than ever before. It was a recipe for unparalleled success and a guaranteed ticket to an absolute catastrophic disaster. The bad guy was dead. The outsider was about to be born. His exit from the WWF wouldn't be a quiet departure. It would be an explosion, an act of defiance that would light the first fuse of a full-scale war. Scott Hall did not just walk out of the World Wrestling Federation in May 1996. He cannonballed out, and the splash would change the entire industry. The curtain call at Madison Square Garden was a symbolic middle finger, an act of defiance by a man who had always been, at his core, an outsider. It was the final arrogant flick of the Razor persona, a character he was now shedding like a snake's skin. He was leaving the grind, the frustration, and the perceived disrespect of the WWF behind. In its place, he had the single richest, most revolutionary contract in the history of professional wrestling. He was headed south to Atlanta to World Championship Wrestling, a company he and his friend Kevin Nash had derided for years as minor league. But Eric Bischoff, the man in charge of WCW, had made him an offer that was impossible to refuse, a multi-year, 7-figure, fully guaranteed contract with a drastically reduced work schedule. It was main event money for a part-time job. It was a golden parachute. But for Scott Hall, it was something more. It was validation. It was the ultimate "I told you so." And it was, for a man already teetering on the edge of a precipice, the removal of the last guardrail. The WWF, for all its faults, was a structured, high-pressure environment run by a notorious disciplinarian, Vince McMahon. Vince demanded functionality. WCW, in contrast, was a loosely run, financially flush organization desperate to win a ratings war. It was a millionaire's playground run by a boss who wanted to be one of the boys. Scott Hall, a man battling a generation of trauma and a raging multi-layered addiction, was just handed the keys to the candy store and the liquor cabinet 8 days. That's all the time it took for the revolution to begin. On May 27, 1996, WCW Monday Nitro was live from Macon, Georgia. It was a standard episode then. A sharp, confident, unmiked voice cut through the arena noise. The camera panned, confused, to the crowd. And there he was. He wasn't in wrestling gear. He was in his civvies, a denim vest, a tight black shirt, blue jeans. He looked like a rebel, a biker, a street corner tough. He looked, in short, like Scott Hall. He vaulted the guardrail, grabbed a live microphone, and stepped into the ring. The silence in the arena was deafening. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated confusion. This was not a WCW wrestler. This was Razor Ramon. What was he doing here? This was a breach of reality, a crack in the fourth wall so profound that everyone was frozen in disbelief. And then he spoke. His voice was not the cartoonish Cuban accent of Razor Ramon. It was his own voice, a low, cool, arrogant drawl. "You know who I am," he said, the voice dripping with contempt, "but you don't know why I'm here." It was perhaps the most important promo in modern wrestling history. He didn't yell, he talked. He talked as if he were an invading soldier. He referred to WCW's owner, Ted Turner, as Billionaire Ted. He referred to the WWF as that other organization. He spoke of a war. "You want a war? You're going to get one," he sneered before throwing the microphone down in disgust. The impact was instantaneous and seismic. The phone lines in WCW's headquarters exploded. Was the WWF actually invading? Was this real? Scott Hall, in a single 3-minute appearance, had just become the most talked about man in the entire industry. He had blurred the line between the performer and the person, a line he had already erased in his own private life. A week later, he was back, taunting the commentators, demanding his opponents. He mentioned he had a big surprise coming, that he wasn't alone. On June 10th, that surprise arrived. As Hall was menacing the broadcast team, a 7-foot giant appeared behind him. It was Kevin Nash, Diesel, his best friend, his brother in arms. They were the outsiders. This was not a wrestling angle. It was a hostile takeover. They dressed in street clothes. They carried baseball bats. They didn't perform wrestling moves. They beat people down. They ambushed wrestlers, power-bombed them through tables, and hijacked the broadcast. They were presented as invading forces, here to destroy WCW, and for a world not yet cynical to the internet, it felt terrifyingly real. Scott Hall was the mouthpiece, the cool one. Nash was the silent, devastating muscle. Hall's promos were masterpieces of unscripted, edgy realism. He was drawing directly from the well of his own personality, the army brat's arrogance, the bartender's effortless authority, the rebel's disdain for the system. The angle culminated at the Bash at the Beach pay-per-view on July 7, 1996. It was Hall and Nash, the outsiders, against WCW's franchise players. The entire story was built around a mystery. Who was the outsider's third man? At the climax of the chaotic match, the arena erupted. Walking slowly down the aisle was the single biggest icon in the history of the sport, Hulk Hogan, the red and yellow clad hero of millions. Hogan climbed into the ring, the crowd roaring, assuming he was there to save WCW. He chased Hall and Nash out. And then, in a moment that stopped the world, he turned, raised his giant boot, and kicked his longtime friend Randy Savage in the face. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash climbed back into the ring, not to fight Hogan, but to embrace him. Hogan, the ultimate hero, had betrayed everyone. The fans, in a fit of pure primal anger, began to pelt the ring with trash. This was the birth of the New World Order. The NWO, and Scott Hall was its co-founder. He was at the epicenter of the single most important, most lucrative, and most industry-changing angle of all time. The NWO was not a wrestling stable. It was a pop culture phenomenon. The simple, stark, black and white NWO t-shirt became the single hottest piece of merchandise on the planet. It was a badge of cool. It was a symbol of rebellion. And it was all because of Scott Hall's idea. Fueled by this reality-based storyline, UCW Monday Nitro began to beat WWF Monday Night Raw in the Monday Night Wars. For 83 consecutive weeks, WCW was the undisputed king of professional wrestling. Scott Hall had not just won the war, he was the one who had fired the first shot. His new contract was a work of art. Not only did he have a guaranteed salary, But he also had a favored nations clause, meaning his contract automatically rose to match almost anyone's. He had creative control. He had a light schedule. He was, in every sense of the word, untouchable. And it was, without question, the worst possible thing that could have ever happened to him. If the WWF was a high-pressure, high-structure environment, WCW was the opposite. It was a lawless, chaotic millionaires' frat party. The guaranteed contract culture meant that the pressure to perform was gone. If you were hungover, you could call in sick, and the seven-figure paycheck would still arrive. For Scott Hall, this was a death sentence. He now possessed three lethal commodities in unlimited supply: money, time, and freedom. He had endless funds to fuel his addictions. His alcohol and cocaine use, which was already at a crisis level, now had an unlimited budget. His light schedule meant more downtime. And for a severe addict, downtime is the enemy. It is the empty space where the demons, the guilt, and the trauma of 1983 come flooding in. And he had freedom. There was no Vince McMahon. Eric Bischoff was not just his boss, he was his friend. Bischoff, by his own admission, didn't know how to handle it. He was trying to manage a friend who was also his biggest star, a man who was literally making him millions by being a bad guy. How do you discipline that? The answer is, you don't, you enable it. And then WCW made a creative decision so grotesque, so cynical, and so profoundly irresponsible that it all but guaranteed Scott Hall's destruction. They decided to blur the lines further. They saw Scott's very real, very public struggles with alcoholism, and they didn't see a man in crisis. They saw a storyline. In 1997, art began to imitate life, or more accurately, life was simply put on camera. Scott Hall, as a character, began showing up to Nitro drunk. He would stumble to the ring, slurring his words, a plastic cup of what was implied to be alcohol in his hand. The horrifying truth was, it wasn't always an act. He was actually showing up to the arena drunk. He was actually in no condition to perform. The line was not just blurred, it was completely, totally erased. He was a man dying of a terminal illness, and his employers were paying him millions to perform that illness as a nightly gimmick. Imagine the psychological torment. He was a man haunted by a deep traumatic guilt, a guilt he was trying to numb with alcohol. And now his job was to portray a bumbling, embarrassing drunk on live television. It was the ultimate humiliation, and it was a green light for his addiction. He was being rewarded both financially and professionally for the very behavior that was killing him. His clique family was still there. Kevin Nash, his best friend, was in an impossible position. He was part partner, part friend, and now unwillingly, part babysitter. He watched helpless as his friend spiraled. His marriage, which had been hanging by a thread for years, finally snapped. His wife Dana could no longer handle the man who was a ghost in his own home, the non-stop cycle of addiction, promises, and relapses. She filed for divorce in 1998. He was losing his family. He was losing his wife, his son Cody, and his daughter Cassidy. This fresh, profound guilt, the guilt of a failed husband and an absent father, was just dumped on top of the already unbearable guilt of 1983. The spiral accelerated. The public-facing incidents began to pile up. At the sold-out pay-per-view in January 1998, Hall was booked in a high-profile match. He was, by all accounts, in no condition to be in a building, let alone a wrestling ring. He was visibly intoxicated. The match was a slow-motion disaster, a sad, pathetic, and deeply uncomfortable spectacle. He began no-showing events. Eric Bischoff and WCW were in a bind. How do you punish one of the co-founders of the NWO? Their solution was to make that part of the story too. Hall would be suspended in reality, sent to a rehab he wasn't ready for, and the cycle would repeat. The NWO itself was becoming a victim of its own success. It was bloated, overexposed, and the cool was fading. The Monday Night Wars, which Hall had started, were now being lost. And Scott Hall, the man at the center of it all, led to the most disgusting and exploitative angle in the history of a business built on exploitation. In late 1998, WCW booked an angle where Hall, playing his drunk character, would feud with his best friend, Kevin Nash. On an episode of Nitro, Hall stumbled to the ring, slurring his words. In a pre-taped segment, Hall, as the drunk, would proceed to projectile vomit all over Eric Bischoff. They literally turned his life-threatening disease into a gross-out comedy skit. They called the character Last Call Scott Hall. This was rock bottom. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. He was an alcoholic. His job was to play an alcoholic. His employers were writing his disease into the script. It was a psychological torture chamber. They turned his real illness into a performance, and it nearly killed him. His reputation, once that of the coolest guy in the room, was now mud. He was a liability. He was a punchline. The man who had walked into WCW as its rebellious savior in 1996 was, by 1999, a bloated, broken, and tragic shell. The NWO was dead. The Monday Night Wars were lost. And WCW, the company he had built, was in its death throes. His body was a wreck. The years of bumps, compounded by the constant corrosive effects of alcohol and drugs, had ravaged him. He was puffy, slow, and perpetually injured. He was arrested for the first time, the beginning of a long and humiliating public rap sheet. WCW, in its final desperate days, had no idea what to do with him. He was sent home, brought back, suspended, and sent to rehab. He was a ghost, haunting the hallways of a company he had built, and in many ways helped destroy the bad guy, had conquered the world. And in the process, Scott Hall had lost everything. He had lost his family, his health, his dignity, and his mind. The man who had everything was now truly the man who had nothing. He was a ghost, haunting the hallways of a dying empire. And as his own life bottomed out, the company he had built was about to take its final breath. In March of 2001, World Championship Wrestling, the company that had once beaten the WWF Goliath and changed the entire industry, finally died. In one last emotional night on TNT, Ted Turner's billion-dollar empire was purchased by his arch-rival Vince McMahon for pennies on the dollar. For most of the wrestlers, it was a moment of profound uncertainty and fear. For Scott Hall, the man who had helped build and unwittingly destroy that house, he wasn't even there. His contract, one of those ironclad guaranteed deals, was being held by the parent company, AOL Time Warner. They would rather pay him to sit at home than risk him appearing in public. He had become too toxic, too unemployable. For nearly a year, Scott Hall was a ghost in the wrestling business. He was a 42-year-old man with the body of a 62-year-old and a bank account that was still collecting six-figure checks for doing nothing. This was a recipe for catastrophe, with no structure of a job, no locker room to socialize in, no pressure to perform on even a minimal level. He was left alone with his three most dangerous commodities: time, money, and his demons. The spiral, which was already out of control, now became a freefall. His days were governed by alcohol, by painkillers, and by cocaine. His physical health deteriorated severely. He was bloated and puffy from the alcohol abuse, his body a map of chronic, agonizing pain. His first arrest in WCW was just the beginning. Now his legal incidents began to pile up. The guilt of being a failed father ate at him. His children, Cody and Cassidy, were growing up without him, knowing him only through slurred phone calls or shameful headlines. The guilt of the 1983 shooting, the ghost that always lurked in the shadows, now had full run of the house. He was drinking to numb the pain of a life he had destroyed, and every drink destroyed it just a little bit more. And yet, in late 2001, an impossible lifeline appeared. Vince McMahon, having won the Monday Night War, was feeling the loss of competition. He wanted to inject a shock into his system. He decided to bring back WCW's biggest idea. He decided to bring back the NWO. In February 2002, at the No Way Out pay-per-view, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Hollywood Hulk Hogan made their return to the WWF not as defeated employees, but as arrogant invaders, hired by McMahon to kill his own creation. For Hall, it was a resurrection. It was a second chance he was back on the grandest stage. He was reunited with his best friends, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he seemed to have it together. He looked better, sharper, more motivated. The return started strong. The story culminated at WrestleMania X8 in Toronto, one of the biggest events in history. That night, Hogan, in a legendary match with The Rock, was reborn as a hero. But Hall's match, just as prominent, was against Stone Cold Steve Austin. It was a dream match, the original bad guy versus the man who defined the Attitude Era. And it was a disaster. Hall was clearly not himself. He was slow, he was heavy, and he moved with the stiffness of a man in profound, agonizing pain. The match, which should have been a classic, was a sloppy, forgettable mess. The magic was gone. It was obvious that the Scott Hall of 2002 was not the Razor Ramon of 1994, or even the NWO Invader of 1996. He was a shell. And immediately, the old habits came rushing back. The structure of the WWF, now even more rigorous after the war, had no tolerance for his demons. He was expected to comply, to be professional, to be sober. He couldn't. The pressure of being back, the physical pain of working a harsh schedule again, and the ever-present temptation of the road, it all shattered whatever thin resolve he had. Incidents started almost immediately. He was accused of disruptions at hotels. He showed up to events in no condition to perform. And then, the catastrophe. During a WWF tour of the United Kingdom, the infamous plane ride from hell occurred. It was a chartered transatlantic flight that, according to multiple people on board, devolved into a chaotic, drunken, and drug-fueled riot. Hall, along with other wrestlers, was accused of severe, unprofessional, and dangerous behavior. That was the last straw. Vince McMahon, who had given him the second chance, had seen enough. Just 3 months after his monumental return, in May 2002, Scott Hall was fired from the WWF. This time, there was no defiant exit. There was no curtain call. He was simply kicked to the curb, deemed an unsalvageable liability. His great comeback was over, in shame. This is when the spiral truly lost its orbit. With no WWF, no WCW, no big league left to save him, Scott Hall fell into the wilderness. He became a mercenary, selling his name to any independent wrestling show that would pay him. He began appearing in high school gyms and bingo halls, wrestling in front of 50 or 100 people. The bad guy, who had once electrified Madison Square Garden, was now struggling in a county fair arena. The spectacle was tragic. He would often show up visibly intoxicated, unable to stand. Promoters would advertise him, and fans would come just to see a car crash. They would watch a bloated, puffy, slurring Scott Hall pathetically attempt the moves that once made him famous. Sometimes he couldn't even make it to the ring. His name became synonymous with unreliable. He would no-show events he was booked and paid for. He would take the money and disappear. He burned every bridge. The fledgling company TNA, Total Nonstop Action, tried to give him multiple chances, mostly out of loyalty to Kevin Nash, who would try to get his friend a job. Each time, it ended identically. A few weeks of professionalism, followed by the inevitable incident, the disappearance, and the quiet firing. His arrests became alarmingly, sickeningly frequent. He was arrested dozens of times. DUIs, trespassing, battery, disorderly conduct. His rap sheet read like a novel. Each new mugshot was a gut punch to the fans who had loved him. The glazed-over eyes, the matted hair, the bloated, confused face. This was not the bad guy. This was a sick, lost man. His health collapsed. The years of alcohol and drug abuse had ravaged his body. He was suffering from cardiomyopathy, a severe heart condition. He began having seizures. He was diagnosed with severe mental health issues, including post-traumatic stress disorder, undoubtedly from the 1983 shooting, and bipolar disorder. He was a mess of diagnoses, treated with a cocktail of prescription drugs which he simply mixed with alcohol, creating a lethal toxic swamp. He became a tragic hermit, locked away in his Florida home, interacting with the world only through disastrous appearances or arrests. He had alienated his children. He had exhausted the patience of every friend, save for the absolute most steadfast. Kevin Nash, his best friend, had to make the painful decision to keep his distance, realizing that their friendship was enabling Hall's self-destruction. And then, in 2010, he hit the absolute bottom. A video surfaced from a small independent wrestling event in Massachusetts. Scott Hall, advertised as the star, was brought out in front of the crowd. He could not walk. He was being held up, almost carried by two men. He was wearing an NWO shirt, but it looked like a soiled Halloween costume on a body that had given up. He was bloated, almost unrecognizable. They propped him up in a wheelchair at an autograph table. The crowd, at first excited to see a legend, quickly fell into a horrified silence. He couldn't hold a pen. He was incoherent. He slurred, his eyes rolling back aimlessly. He was a walking corpse. But the real horror came later. The promoter, in an unfathomable decision, allowed him, or forced him, to get in the ring for a match. They propped him up. He could barely stand. His opponent had to literally hold him up while pretending to attack him. Finally, Hall just fell down. He couldn't get back up. The match, if you could call it that, was stopped. He was hospitalized. When that video hit the internet, it shocked the wrestling world. This wasn't a storyline. This wasn't Last Call Scott Hall. This was a 400-pound man, swollen with organ failure, dying in front of us. It was the saddest, most humiliating image of his career. It was a man who had lost everything, including his last shred of dignity. Everyone turned their back. Promoters banned him. Companies blacklisted him. Fans wrote his eulogy. Scott Hall, the bad guy, was, for all intents and purposes, dead. He was just a man in a room in Florida, alone with his booze, his pills, and his ghosts, waiting for the inevitable end. But in that darkness, there was one old friend whom he hadn't spoken to in years, who had watched this downfall from a distance with a heavy heart. A man who, like Hall, had seen his career crumble and had found salvation in an unlikely place. Diamond Dallas Page, his diamond stud manager from all those years ago, a man who had built a wellness empire from the ashes of his own career, picked up the phone. He was about to make one last call, one final, desperate attempt. He was about to offer Scott Hall one last lifeline. It was a chance not just at sobriety, but at a resurrection. The video of Scott Hall's 2010 independent show appearance wasn't just humiliating. It was a public execution. It was the visual evidence that the man they knew as Razor Ramon was gone, replaced by a 400-pound, incoherent, and dying shell. He was a man who had been given up on by the fans, by the industry, and, by all accounts, by himself. He was in his home in Florida, a toxic prison of his own making, mixing prescription drugs and alcohol, and simply waiting for his body to quit. But the video had been seen by one man who refused to accept that ending. Diamond Dallas Page, Scott's first manager from his Diamond Stud days, had watched the footage with a mixture of horror and fury. DDP was no longer just a wrestler. He had rebuilt his own life from the ashes of injury, creating a massive wellness brand called DDP Yoga. He had already performed a miracle by saving another fallen legend, Jake the Snake Roberts, from a near-identical spiral. DDP made the call. It was not a gentle, sympathetic check-in. It was, by his own admission, a brutal, tough-love intervention. The offer was simple and stark. You can come live with me in Atlanta in my accountability crib. You will follow my program every single day, no excuses, or you can stay in Florida and you can die. This is the last call. Scott, in a rare moment of lucidity, his body and spirit completely broken, had only one answer left. He said yes. In 2012, Scott Hall, bloated, broken, and wheelchair-bound, arrived at DDP's home. This was not a rehabilitation clinic. This was a ground zero boot camp for the soul, and he was not alone. He moved in alongside Jake Roberts. It was a house of broken gods, two of the greatest minds in wrestling history, who were now reduced to two old, sick men, their bodies ravaged by their demons. The entire process was being filmed for a documentary, The Resurrection of Jake the Snake, adding a layer of raw, unflinching accountability. There was, literally, nowhere to hide. The first days were not about redemption. They were about survival. Scott was in a state of catastrophic physical decay. His heart was weak, his organs were failing, and his body was in a constant state of agonizing pain from decades of bumps and substance abuse. He was 400 pounds of inflammation, trauma, and despair. He was so broken, he couldn't even get out of bed on his own. DDP's program was not a simple detox, it was a total rewiring. It started with food. DDP threw out every processed, toxic item and replaced it with clean, organic nutrition. And it started with movement. DDP Yoga, a system designed to be low impact, was the only thing his broken body could even attempt. The early footage is harrowing. It is a portrait of pure suffering. Scott, sweating and shaking, his hands trembling from withdrawal, could not perform the most basic of movements. He couldn't stand on one leg. He couldn't lift his arms. His frustration was palpable, a lifetime of bad guy arrogance, replaced by the raw, humiliating vulnerability of a man who couldn't control his own body. He would fall, he would curse, he would weep in frustration, but DDP was relentless. He was a drill sergeant, a life coach, and a brother. He was in Scott's face every single day, dragging him out of bed, putting him on the yoga mat, and refusing to let him quit. And crucially, Scott had Jake Roberts by his side. They were two old gunslingers, supporting each other. When one wanted to give up, the other, with a shared understanding of their specific hell, would offer a gruff word of encouragement. This was not just a physical battle. For the first time in his adult life, Scott Hall was sober. And with sobriety, the walls he had built for 30 years came crashing down. The alcohol and drugs were gone, and there was nothing left to numb the ghosts. The trauma of the 1983 shooting, the profound, gut-wrenching guilt over his divorce, the shame of being an absent, headline-making father to his children. Cody and Cassidy, it all came flooding in. He had to face it, all of it. DDP's program wasn't just about yoga. It was about accountability. He had to sit, sober, and talk through the wreckage of his life. He had to confront the bad guy and admit that it was a mask for a very broken, very scared man. Slowly, impossibly, a change began. The first victory wasn't a championship. It was Scott being able to walk to the mailbox. Then he could stand on his own. The yoga, which he once mocked, was healing him. The clean food was reducing the inflammation. The weight began to melt away. 400 pounds became 350. 350 became 300. As the physical weight vanished, his face reemerged. The puffiness disappeared, and you could see his eyes again. And in those eyes, for the first time in a decade, there was a spark. His famous razor-sharp wit, which had been buried under a fog of intoxication, began to return. He started cracking jokes. He started to look and sound like Scott Hall. His body was so damaged from his wrestling career that he was in constant agony, his hip joint completely destroyed. He needed a hip replacement to even continue the recovery. He had no money and no insurance. DDP, seeing his friend's genuine effort, launched a public crowdfunding campaign. The wrestling community, the fans who had watched him spiral, had seen the documentary footage and now saw the real, tangible effort he was making. They didn't just meet the goal, they shattered it in days. It was a thunderous validation. The world hadn't given up on him. They wanted him to win. After the surgery, his recovery accelerated. He was back on the mat, his new hip allowing him to move in ways he hadn't in 20 years. He lost over 100 pounds in total. The bloated 400-pound man who'd been rolled into DDP's house in a wheelchair was gone. In his place stood a lean, muscular 280-pound man. He began the painful, necessary work of mending his family. He reconnected with his son Cody, who was now a grown man. He had the difficult, sober conversations with his daughter Cassidy. He apologized. He didn't make excuses. He just tried one day at a time to be a father. Then in early 2014, the phone rang. It was the call that signified the resurrection was complete. It was the WWE. They were offering him his legacy back. Scott Hall was to be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, class of 2014, as Razor Ramon. On the night of the ceremony, a man walked out onto the stage. He was not last call Scott Hall. He was not the broken man in the wheelchair. He was a movie star. He was lean, sharp, and handsome, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, his hair slicked back. His eyes were clear, bright, and sober. The arena erupted in a standing ovation, a roar of love and relief. He grabbed the microphone, and the old bad guy swagger was back, but this time it was tempered with a profound, hard-won humility. He was funny, he was emotional, and he was, above all, grateful. He thanked DDP and Jake Roberts for saving his life. He thanked his children for forgiving him. And then he delivered the single greatest line of his entire career, a line that perfectly encapsulated his entire tragic and triumphant journey. Hard work pays off, dreams come true. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do. It was the period at the end of the sentence. It was not just a speech. It was an epitaph for his demons. Scott Hall had gone to war with himself, a war that had raged for 30 years, fueled by trauma, guilt, and addiction. And on that stage, in front of the world, he had finally, definitively won. He hadn't just gotten his life back. He had reclaimed his legacy. The bad guy was back, and he was, for the first time, whole. The 2014 Hall of Fame induction was more than a ceremony. It was a resurrection. Scott Hall had walked to the edge of the abyss, stared into it, and, with the help of his friends, he had turned around and walked back. The standing ovation he received wasn't just for Razor Ramon's career. It was for Scott Hall's survival. He had done the impossible. He had beaten the demons that had claimed so many of his peers. In the years that followed, the world was treated to a version of Scott Hall that many, including himself, thought was lost forever. He was sober, he was healthy, and he was present. He became a beloved elder statesman of the industry he had helped revolutionize. He was a fixture at fan conventions, no longer the tragic, bloated car crash, but a sharp, witty, and engaging legend. Fans lined up not just for a photo, but to hear him tell stories, his razor-sharp wit fully intact. More importantly, he became a father again. He rebuilt the bridges that his addiction had burned to the ground. He was a constant, proud presence in the life of his son, Cody, who was now forging his own path as a professional wrestler. He reconnected with his daughter, Cassidy. He was finally the family man he had always wanted to be, but had been too sick to become. His brotherhood with the Clique was also reforged, but on new, healthier terms. He could share a stage with Kevin Nash and Shawn Michaels, not for a party, but for a genuine reunion. In 2020, this legacy was cemented when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame for a second time as a member of the New World Order. It was a fitting, definitive acknowledgement of his dual, immeasurable impact on the business. He was, by all accounts, at peace. He lived a quiet life in Georgia, a living miracle and a beacon of hope for others struggling with addiction. But the human body is a remorseless bookkeeper. It keeps a perfect, detailed record of every abuse. Scott Hall had won the war for his soul, but the decades-long battle had left the battlefield, his body irreversibly scarred. The years of alcoholism had done permanent damage to his heart. The decades of taking bumps as a 6'7" athlete had culminated in a body that was in a state of chronic, agonizing pain. In early March 2022, that clock ran out of time. At his home in Georgia, Scott suffered a fall. He broke his hip. For a healthy man, this would be a serious but manageable injury. For Scott Hall, it was a catastrophic event. His body, already compromised by cardiomyopathy, was simply not equipped to handle such a massive trauma. He underwent hip replacement surgery, but in the days following, a blood clot dislodged. It was the final tragic complication. Scott suffered 3 massive heart attacks, one right after the other. He was placed on life support, but the damage was done. His family was called, his closest friends, Kevin Nash, Shawn Michaels, DDP, Triple H, flew to his bedside. They gathered in a hospital room in Georgia for one last curtain call. On March 14, 2022, after his family and friends had said their final private goodbyes, the decision was made. Scott Hall was removed from life support. He passed away peacefully at the age of 63. The outpouring of love and grief was immediate, a testament not to the icon, but to the man he had worked so hard to become. For decades, Scott Hall's story was a tragedy in plain sight, a man seemingly destined to become a grim statistic. The world had prepared his eulogy years ago, a sad story of wasted potential, but he rewrote that ending. His true legacy is one of defiant resurrection. He proved that no one is beyond saving and that the bottom is not the end. He did not die as Last Call Scott Hall. He did not die the bloated, tragic figure in a wheelchair. He died a Hall of Famer. He died a sober man. He died a beloved father and a brother, surrounded by the men who had saved him and who he, in turn, had inspired. He had finally found his peace. His story, a testament to the human spirit, is best summarized in his own immortal words. Hard work pays off. Dreams come true. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do.